Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, and welcome to Command Power, the show in which we discuss all things Magic the Gathering with a focus on Commander. And today we have a brand new deck tech for you from the new set Phyrexia All Will Be One. And just a quick heads up, this is not a budget deck tech, so there are going to be some expensive cards in there, although I think it shouldn't be too hard to find substitutions for those expensive cards. But before we do that, just a quick reminder to please click subscribe if you enjoy these videos. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm really notices me, and we're currently growing the channel, and it helps me a lot. Much appreciated. And today we're going to be talking about Kethek, Crucible Goliath, a brand new commander from Phyrexia All Will Be One. And if you don't know what Kethek does, it is for 2 colors, 1 black and 1 red, a 4/4 legendary creature, Phyrexian beast. At the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice another creature. If you do, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a non-legendary creature card with lesser mana value. Put it onto the battlefield, then put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So this is very similar to Cascade. Basically, you're going to be able to sacrifice one of your cards to cascade into something that costs less, as long as it's a creature and it's not legendary. So that's a really sweet ability, and I loved this from the second it was spoiled, because I really like abilities that kind of make the game exciting and fun, where you never know what you're gonna get, and this fits that build perfectly. You're basically flipping every time, and sometimes you're gonna hit amazing things, and sometimes you're gonna hit less amazing, but it's always gonna be a different experience. So the way we're going to be building around this deck is we're going to be building around death triggers, so we want creatures that give us value when they die. We're going to be building a little bit around discounts, so we're going to try to play cards that cost very little to get out initially, but we can then sacrifice for full value. We're also going to work with making token copies of creatures because they retain their mana values, so they're very good to sack to Kethek. And anyway, those are just some of the directions we're going to go with this deck. I'm really excited to go through the list, so without further ado, let's get started. We're starting off with Ancient Stone Idol. This is a staple in a lot of my lists, and I think it's very good here. It has multiple uses. You can ambush somebody with this, but it can also just come down early on for very cheap if you're attacking with a bunch of creatures. And then when we sacrifice it to Kethek, we can basically hit almost any creature in our deck, and we're also going to get a 6/12 trample to go with it, so it's just a very, very solid card. Anger is a great one to sacrifice with Kethek, because once it's in the graveyard, all of our creatures are going to have haste. Archfiend of Sorrows is an interesting one to cascade into with Kethek, because it's going to immediately give -2/-2 to all your opponent's creatures, but it's also a great one to unearth, because when you unearth it, you can then sacrifice it to the Kethek trigger, at which point you're just basically getting a cascade for a 7 without having to give up an actual creature, since this was going to die anyway. Avatar of Woe is going to be super easy to turn on in this deck. There's going to be a bunch of creatures in graveyards. We're sacrificing a lot, and then we can just use it to destroy the opponent's best creature every turn, or we can also sacrifice it to cascade into something big, hopefully. Body Launderer is going to be really good in this deck. It's going to allow us to loot every time one of our non-token creatures dies, which should be happening quite a bit. Because of that, we can fill our graveyard for the few reanimation effects that we have, and then also as this gets bigger and bigger, it becomes better to sacrifice as well, because it can bring something straight back from the graveyard to the battlefield. Chainer, Nightmare Adept, is one of those ways that we can reanimate cards from the graveyard. It's going to allow us to have some nice recursion late game and make sure that even if we sacrifice some powerful stuff early, we can always get it back later. Chaos Defiler is an absolute all-star in so many decks. I keep praising this card, and it's just insane. In this deck, it's going to be particularly good because we can just play it, have it destroy something at random, and then immediately sack it to Kethek at the end of turn to get another destruction trigger and cascade for 5. Just really good. Corpse Augur is going to draw us an absolute ton of cards if things go well, and seeing as we have a reliable way to sacrifice it at the end of our turn, we should be able to trigger this whenever we need to. Disciple of Bolas is going to be really nice to come in, get us some value by sacrificing something with a death trigger, and then just stick around to either be sacrificed to Kethek or as fodder for any of our other cards. Doomweaver is going to be really, really good in this deck. If we play it when our opponents are tapped out, this can just draw us a ton of cards out of nowhere, because we can pair it with a creature and then immediately sacrifice the other creature to Kethek and draw cards equal to that creature's power. And then whatever comes into play with Kethek, we can immediately pair again with Doomweaver for extra value. Felden of the Third Path is really good in all sorts of decks that are looking to sacrifice things. This is going to make tokens from all those big things that we have in our graveyard. A lot of them have ETB or death triggers, so they're going to work really well with this. And then we can sacrifice the token to Kethek for full value. Firbolg Flutist, I think, is a really spicy one. We're going to get a creature we don't control and suddenly give it Myriad, which means we're going to be attacking with a bunch of them. Then we can sacrifice the original to Kethek or any of our other sacrifice effects, and all those tokens can also be sacrificed if we need to. Very, very solid. Also a great one to sacrifice itself later on and reanimate, because we get the trigger each time. Thorik the Tomb Show is an interesting one. There's basically 2 ways we can play it. We can play it for 6 mana and then immediately sacrifice it to Kethek, at which point we're guaranteed to get 1 card back from our graveyard and cascade for 8. That's pretty decent, but you could also get a little bit greedier and exile multiple things with it, and then hope to attack with it a couple of times before sacrificing sacrificing it so you can return multiple things from your graveyard to your hand. Greater Gargadon is one of the weaker cards in the deck, but it's still pretty solid. We can suspend it for 10, which is going to take a lot of time, but then you can sacrifice any of your other things, including cards with death triggers, or if anybody board wipes, we can just sacrifice things to this, at which point it gets closer and closer to coming down. When it comes down, it can hit immediately for 9, and then we can sacrifice at the end of turn to get a cascade for 10, which is going to be sweet. Hidetsugu Devouring Chaos is going to be really good in this deck. It's a sacrifice trigger that is something we want in the deck. It's also going to scry, which actually helps with our Kethek cascades, and then we can also use the other ability. Since a lot of our deck has such high mana values, we can actually deal a ton of damage with this to our opponent. Illumina Xeris is a great little sacrifice outlet that's going to add a ton of mana to our mana pool and let us have some really explosive plays. Immersturm Predator is great because it's a free sacrifice outlet that also exiles stuff from our opponent's graveyard and survives board wipes. It basically does a lot of different stuff in this deck. Draxus the Troublemaker is similar to Felden. It can make token copies of stuff that can be sacrificed to all of our sacrifice effects, and they also draw us a card when they die, so this is a great source of card advantage. Junji the Midnight Sky is going to be really good for reanimating something from a graveyard when it dies, so this is a great thing to sacrifice. It can also just make our opponents discard too. Sometimes that might be the play if they're very low on cards. Now you may have noticed we have about 10 legendary creatures in the deck, which is not an insignificant count, and that's not that bad though, because remember, we aren't cascading into the legendaries. That basically can mean that we sculpt what we cascade into a little bit better. Keen Duelist is a card I really like in every game of Commander because it just provides such fun interaction, and it's going to allow for a little bit of politics, and since our deck is so high mana value, our opponents are going to take a ton of damage from this. Kinzu of the Bleak Coven is a great one for getting extra value of our creatures dying. It has a tiny bit of anti-synergy with our reanimation effects, but we're not running that many of those, and we don't actually have to exile it if we don't want to. It's a May ability. But when this works, it's going to be incredibly good, and then randomly we can just win some games with Toxic occasionally, which is really good. Machias the Unhallowed is going to be really good with this deck because anything we sacrifice is going to immediately come back with Undying, with an extra +1/+1 counter. Anything that isn't a human, must be said, but then again, most of our deck is not humans, so this is a must kill on sight for our opponents. Molten Primordial can finish games in a hurry, and then after we've got the trigger, we don't really care that much. We can sacrifice it. We can also sacrifice one of the things we stole. There's a lot of ways that this can be really good, and reanimating it and getting it back later on is just fantastic. Morbid Opportunist is just one of the best ways to draw cards in decks that are interested in sacrificing their creatures. Necron Deathmark is going to be really good by filling up our graveyard and also killing one of our opponent's creatures. Nightmare Shepherd is very similar to Kinzu of the Bleak Coven, and again, it's a May ability, so we don't have to do it if we're not interested in doing it, but it's just going to provide a lot of nice extra value. Noxious Gearhulk is another removal staple onto a creature, and this one is going to gain us life as well, which is nice because we have a few effects that cost us life. Obsidian Charmer has a pretty nifty cost reduction, which means that we can often play it for just 2 mana, and then it comes in and destroys a non-basic land, which is great. And since we've already got the trigger off of it, which is the main thing, we can sacrifice it to cascade into something better. So at that point, you've paid 2 mana, destroyed one of our opponent's lands, and got a replacement creature. Phyrexian Delver is a great way to reanimate stuff from our graveyard, and it serves absolutely no purpose after you've got the ETB from it, so it's a very, very good target to sacrifice. Prowling Geistcatcher is really solid if you can get it going, although it is a little bit slow. However, once you get this engine going, it leaves the battlefield trigger, so they can't even exile it to stop it from happening. And basically, whenever you sacrifice a creature, you can put it under Prowling Geistcatcher, and then when this dies, all those creatures are going to come right back into the battlefield. That's really, really strong. Puppeteer Click is a great one to sacrifice because of Persist, and it's also going to steal your opponent's creatures, which means that you can just sacrifice them if you want to, which is very nice too. Ravenous Chupacabra is a removal spell on a creature, very solid card. Sepulchral Primordial is a great finisher in this deck. It's going to get us back a bunch of creatures, and then we're probably just going to sacrifice this and get it back later on for even more value. Shadow of Mortality is really fun because at 15 mana cost, it means that it's going to cascade into basically any creature in the deck. It's also incredibly good with something like Hidetsugu, Devouring Chaos, just a really sweet card. Solemn Simulacrum is just a staple in Commander. It can draw us a card and it can search us land, and we're absolutely okay with sacrificing it. Varagolf Bloodsky Sire is a pretty cool one in this deck because after it attacks, we can search our library for a card and put it on top. That means we can cascade into exactly what we want to with our Kethek trigger, which is really sweet. Zealous Conscripts is again a staple in lots of Commander games. We can gain control of any permanent, but usually we're going to choose a creature so that we can then sacrifice it to Kethek, and then we can sacrifice the Zealous Conscripts themselves the next turn because they've already done their job. Moving on to our artifacts, we have Mimic Vat, which is going to make extra token copies of creatures. They retain their mana value, so that's really sweet. Strionic Resonator is going to copy Kethek's triggered ability, and other triggered abilities in the deck can also be copied, which is going to give us a ton of value. And Whip of Erebos is going going to give all of our creatures lifelink, and it's also going to reanimate creatures from our graveyard for one last hurrah, and then we can sacrifice them. Next up we have sorceries. Blasphemous Act is a staple removal in Commander. Corpse Explosion is going to be particularly good in this deck because we have a lot of high powered creatures, so we can use this as a very cheap board wipe. Feed the Swarm is going to let us deal with enchantments at the cost of some life. Incarnation Technique is always good in these kind of decks, and it's going to allow us to get 2 creatures, probably very big ones, straight onto the battlefield. And Victimize is going to let us sacrifice something to get our creatures back into play. For instance, we have Bedevil, which is a really nice staple removal. Chaos Warp, which is more staple removal, but it can deal with enchantments as well. Malakir Rebirth, which is going to protect our commander very nicely whilst also being a land. Overwhelming Remorse is great in this deck because we're going to have so many creatures in our graveyard that we should be able to cast this for very cheap. And Tibalt's Trickery is a really good way to interact with the stack. Red doesn't really have many cards that do this, so it's nice that we get one here. For enchantments, we have Bitter Reunion, which is great to draw some cards and fill our graveyard, and which we can also sacrifice to give our creatures haste. Flame Shadow Conjuring is going to work really well. We're going to be able to pay 1 extra mana to get a token copy, which we can then use for our sacrificial rites. Heartless Summoning is going to be super solid in this deck by reducing the cost of all of our creatures by 2. And Industrial Advancement is one of my favorite cards. It's going to allow for some super fun stuff to happen, and is particularly good in a deck full of big fatties. Finally, we have Planeswalkers. We have Luca, Coppercoat, Outcast. This is a really interesting one because it's not usually playable in most decks, but the -2 is really solid here. We can exile a creature we control, then reveal cards from the top of our library until we reveal a creature card that costs more. So we're always trading up with this. It is unfortunate that we need to exile, but we're still going to be getting some solid value. And for lands, we have High Market so that we can sacrifice our creatures whenever we need to. We have Scavenging Grounds to deal with our opponent's graveyards. We have Tectonic Edge to deal with our opponent's lands. Bojuka Bog is another way for us to deal with opposing graveyards. And Tomb Fortress is a really sweet land that can straight up reanimate a creature from our graveyard. Incredibly solid card. So there you have it. That has been our Kethek Crucible Goliath deck tech. What do you think? Are there any things you would change? Any additions that you think I missed? Please let me know in the comments section below. I read all comments and respond to all of them too. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click like or subscribe. It really helps the channel. And until next time, take care. Woo!